Hey guys, it's 2019 and I have to do a story on how the New York Times is already smearing the Bernie Sanders 2020 candidacy before it even gets off the ground. Now, I want to turn your attention to a New York Times political reporter named Sidney Ember. Sidney's recently run 3 hit pieces on Bernie Sanders, and I want to walk you through each of them. The first in the series was published on November 23rd, and it's a piece called Bernie Sanders, Lion of the Left, but Not the Only One Roaring. And in that piece, Sidney Ember makes a ton of false claims that I've got to show you right here. So the first thing that's crazy about this piece is that Sidney Ember says it's unclear whether or not Sanders can still get votes. Not true. He only continues to gain popularity. Now, even more absurdly, she then contends that although Sanders was a sensation in 2016, he has since been, quote, outflanked on the left by rising stars like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Beto O'Rourke. Now, some may be able to argue that Ocasio-Cortez is to the left of Sanders, but Beto O'Rourke from Texas, who voted much more in line with Trump than Sanders ever has, is by no means to the left of Bernie Sanders. And to say that he's outflanked Sanders when the two aren't even in the same category just makes no sense. All right, so that's just the first of 3 hit pieces, and they get worse and worse and worse. So on December 27th, Sidney Ember, the very same author, puts out another piece for Bernie Sanders holding on to support may be hard in a 2020 bid. Wow, that's odd. I've never seen any numbers that indicated Sanders support had declined. So let's read what numbers Sidney Ember has to point to. Oh, this is interesting. Sidney Ember's actually not pointing to any numbers. Instead, what she writes is, some of his top congressional supporters won't commit to backing him if he runs for president again. Sounds interesting. Sanders didn't have any establishment support in 2016 and he made out just fine. She then writes, a handful of former aides might work for other candidates. This is politics, Sidney Ember. Staffers move from campaign to campaign. That's the nature of our business. She then goes on, Mr. Sanders may have been the runner-up in the last Democratic primary, but instead of expanding on his nucleus of support in the fashion of most repeat candidates, the Vermont senator is struggling to retain even what he garnered 2 years ago, when he was far less of a political star than he is today. Now, that's just factually inaccurate because we have numbers that show that Sanders' support has actually grown over time, but that's okay, Sidney Ember. Let's just forget the facts. Not only a week went by before Sidney Ember put out another hit piece on Sanders. This one was published by the Times on January 2nd, and the headline says, sexism claims from Bernie Sanders' 2016 run, paid less, treated worse. And so basically what this piece talks about is that former staffers of the Bernie Sanders campaign experienced sexual harassment from other former staffers of the Bernie Sanders campaign. These are awful things that occurred, but again, they have nothing to do with Bernie Sanders himself. He was in no way aware of these allegations at the time. They're just coming to light now. And to portray this as somehow a blunder on Bernie Sanders' part is a blatant hit job, a smear piece. This is nothing but the mainstream media grasping onto any straw they can, trying to take down a candidate who they were never successfully able to with a sticky smear in the past. Okay, so those are 3 smear pieces, all written by the same author. I was aware that the Times was pretty partisan in the past, but never before did I understand quite how blatant their propaganda has become. I was honestly shocked to see that the same author, Sidney Ember, was behind all 3 of these stories. And what shocked me even more when I went to Sidney Ember's Twitter is that she and virtually the entire New York Times political reporting staff had seemed to form a coalition dedicated to defeating the Bernie Sanders candidacy before Sanders had even announced. And let me just show you what I mean. If you look at Sidney Ember's Twitter feed, she's obsessed with taking down Sanders. Or should I say, stopping Sanders before he's even a thing. Here we see that Sidney Ember is retweeting her own story, which was first retweeted by another journalist at the New York Times. If we scroll down more, we see that yet again, Sidney Ember is retweeting her story, which was shared by yet another New York Times journalist. When we go down, much of the same thing. Sidney Ember retweeting her smear on Bernie Sanders, retweeted by another New York Times journalist. If we keep going, Sidney Ember retweeting her Bernie Sanders story, retweeted by yet another New York Times journalist. When I saw how many people at the New York Times were all simultaneously sharing these negative Sanders stories, I couldn't help but feel like this entire smear campaign was coordinated. As I went down the feed, it wasn't hard to find more evidence. Patrick Healy, New York Times politics editor, also sharing the Sanders story. Again, Sidney Ember amplifying it. Stedman, another New York Times reporter, sharing the Sanders story. Sidney Ember pushing it more. Sidney Ember pushing it even more. Sidney Ember pushing it again. I couldn't believe my eyes. I scrolled down more. Sidney Ember, again, sharing negative Bernie Sanders stories. Retweeted again by more New York Times columnists. More Sidney Ember on negative negative Sanders. More Jonathan Martin of the New York Times. Negative Sanders stories. More Stedman of the New York Times. Negative Sanders stories. More Patrick Healy. Negative Sanders stories. The New York Times is working together to try to stop Sanders. Now, before I sign off, I've just got to point out that this isn't the first time that the New York Times has done this. Back in 2016, the Times put out an article that surprisingly praised Sanders. The headline read, "Bernie Sanders scored victories for years via legislative side doors," and the piece talked about how he was especially effective as a senator in using amendments to get real change done. But after the piece was received pretty well and actually Sanders himself shared the story, the Times changed it. They changed the headline to take away "scored victories for years" and replaced it with "via legislative side doors, Bernie Sanders won modest victories." Now, not only that, but the Times also changed a few more things. The Times also yanked out a quote from Bernie's longtime policy advisor that read, "It has been a very successful strategy," and they replaced that positive remark with a few negative ones. These two sentences came in the second iteration of the Times story, the more negative version. But in this presidential campaign, Mr. Sanders is trying to scale up those kinds of proposals as a national agenda, and there's little to draw from his small ball legislative approach to suggest that he could succeed. Well, interestingly, in the earlier version, there was actually a line that said it has been a very successful strategy. The Times also added one more negative remark. Mr. Sanders is suddenly promising not just a few stars here and there, but the moon and a good part of the sun, from free college tuition paid for with giant tax hikes to a huge increase in government health care, which has made even liberal Democrats skeptical. Well, speaking as a liberal Democrat myself, the only thing here that makes me skeptical is that the New York Times is trying to influence the news rather than report it.